Welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast. I am Kristen Boyce, a licensed marriage and family therapist with a private practice, Pathways to Healing Counseling. Through conversations, education, strategies, and shared stories, we will be closing the chapter on all the thoughts, feelings, people, and circumstances that don't serve you anymore and open the door to possibilities and the real you. You won't want to miss an episode, so be sure to subscribe. Welcome to this week's Close the Chapter podcast. I am so grateful you are listening today. If you are on a growth journey and you really are thirsty and longing to feel more whole, authentic, reconnected to yourself, empowered to have a voice, this is the episode for you. And this is the podcast for you. You've come to the right place. And I just want to say thank you for sharing this and sending it to your friends and family. I am on a quest and on a mission to change conversations with those that we love, to have deeper, more meaningful, open, and expansive conversations rather than just how's the weather. So if that resonates with you, you come to the right place and you are welcome. And I'm so glad you're here. I just had a wonderful conversation with an author that I had her book, and I've heard her on many podcasts and really liked what she had to say. And she's written a newer book in February. So let me introduce you to today's guest. Lisa Marchiano is an author, podcaster, and certified Jungian analyst. She is the author of 3 books published by Sounds True: Motherhood, Facing and Finding Yourself. That's the book I already had. The Vital Spark: Reclaim Your Outlaw Energies and Find Your Feminine Fire. And forthcoming Dream Wise: Unlocking the Meaning of Your Dreams. She is the creator and co-host of the popular deep dive psychology podcast, The Jungian Life, and has a private practice in Philadelphia. We dove into the 8 characteristics of finding your vital spark, meaning what are maybe some of these parts that you've severed, you've been conditioned out of, you really disconnected from because they scare you or you don't know how to access them. We really talked about these 8 characteristics. We talked about victimhood and people pleasing and fawning. And we are on a quest to become our whole, complete selves, not fragmented parts, not a role, and how to be assertive in relationships. That's something we've kind of lost because it was conditioned out of us. She gives lots of examples on how to be more assertive and find your voice, even though you might be afraid. It's the quest to reclaim severed parts of yourself. So if you want to download the journal, that's for free. You grab that at Kristen, KRISTENDBoyce.com/free resources. Feel free to share this on social media. That's how people find out about the podcast. It's literally by people sharing it on social, forwarding it on in a text message, talking about it, saying how it's helped you. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for sharing this. And we are on this mission together to get beyond surface conversations, have deeper, meaningful conversations. And what are you learning? And what's lighting you up? How are you growing? Where do you feel lost? What are your fears? Like, let's talk about the real stuff. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Lisa. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome to this week's Close the Chapter podcast. I am so excited to have my guest on today. I have read her book, Motherhood. I'm holding it if you're watching on video. I'm holding the book. Highly recommend it. Motherhood. I love the subtitle, Facing and Finding Yourself, because I feel like as a therapist, that's what I help people do. And I've been on that journey of doing that myself. And I think that's critical. And then you've written a new book that was released in February, The Vital Spark. So Lisa, yay! And she's holding up The Vital Spark because I don't have that one. So yeah, and it's a beautiful cover. I love the fiery red on it. So Lisa, welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yes, it's good to be here. Good to see you. My first question that came through as I was reading Motherhood and then reading about The Vital Spark, because on Instagram, you have some wonderful summations of your chapters. Yes. What came through from me is the question of, is the motherhood wound our deepest wound, do you find?
Let's see. I don't know that I see motherhood so much as a wound as an opportunity to discover where our wounds are and maybe even heal them. So, whatever the parts of yourself that you haven't known about, worked on before becoming a mother, chances are, and maybe some that you do know about, you have worked on, chances are that you're going to experience those light up in a new way in the challenges of motherhood. So that's why motherhood is such an incredible opportunity for self knowledge and growth, because it will introduce or perhaps reintroduce you to aspects of yourself that you maybe didn't want to know about or that you've struggled with before. And so it's very, in a way, it's a very confronting experience.
I agree 1,000%. It mirrors back to us an invitation on the regular of
Mm-hmm.
exploration and delayering and curiosity. So, how did you birth motherhood? And then, how does the vital spark kind of tie
Yeah.
in together with your first book?
So motherhood came to me as a, well, let's see. Let me tell the story from the beginning. So my daughter was 2 and my son was an infant. And I was in analytic training to become a Jungian analyst. I'm a Jungian analyst, but I had to take the year off because I'd just given birth to my son. So it was December and it was one of those mornings. I don't know about you, but my kids used to wake up at like 4:45 in the morning and that was it. They were like awake for the day. At that point, by the time you hit 8 a.m., it's already been a long day. That would just, oh my God, that was really tough. So it was probably like 8 o'clock in the morning. I'd been awake for hours. I was exhausted. I'd probably like given them breakfast. And then I was, what am I going to do for the next, 14 hours until it's time to go to bed? What am I going to do? So I was like, all right, let's just go for a walk. It was bitter cold out. I got everyone bundled up, which is so difficult. Little baby and a toddler, getting them in their coats and their snowsuits and everything. It just like takes forever. Put them in the double stroller, and then I'm pushing the double stroller down the sidewalk. And in my neighborhood, it's this beautiful old neighborhood, but the tree roots have made the sidewalks really uneven. So the double stroller is just impossible. I'm like pushing, it's freezing cold out. And I just found myself thinking like everything about being a mother is so hard. That was the idea that came to me. And then the next idea that kind of came up, like sometimes you say something and some part of yourself answers was, yeah, and I'm growing so much as a result. I was like, oh my God, where did that idea come from? That is such an interesting idea. Because I think I'd always thought that psychological growth kind of stopped when you had kids, which is an incredibly ludicrous thing to think. But I think I actually thought that somehow I would only be growing as a person if I were like out in the work world or studying or something like that. But no, the idea totally captivated me. And as I mentioned before, I was in training to become a Jungian analyst. And Jung has this idea of that he called individuation, which in the way he uses it is a little bit different than how we might be used to it. Individuation in the Jungian sense refers to the lifelong development over the course of one's whole life trajectory to becoming more whole. So it's not just separating from parents, it's really kind of becoming the person you were meant to be. So I was thinking, wow, so this is individuation. Near tears as I struggle to push the double stroller over the tree roots. I'm growing. I'm becoming who I'm meant to be. So I thought, well, I want to read that book. Who's written about that? So later on that day, when the kids finally napped, I got online and was looking, well, who's written about this? I couldn't find anything. So I didn't right away think, oh, I'm going to write that book. But I did think, well, that's going to be my thesis in analytic training. And it was. And then while I was working on the thesis, I was like, there is a book here. I need to write it. And so I finished analytic training in 2011 and didn't sell the book until 2019. So that was also a process. But I kept on thinking, do I just want to scrap this? It's really hard to sell a book. But I would check in, I'd be like, no, I just got to keep going. And so I did eventually sell it. And then after motherhood, the vital spark just kind of presented itself. I have a podcast called This Jungian Life, and we were doing a podcast episode on female initiations. And I was so on fire in that podcast episode. I had much to say. I had all of these fairy tales. I like to explore these themes using fairy tales. I just had so much energy. We finished the podcast. It's like, that's my next book. As motherhood had this really long gestation, the Vital Spark was like, oh, I need to write that. And so it did. It did happen much more quickly, but the themes do overlap. The Vital Spark sort of picks up where motherhood left off in a way. And it's also, whereas motherhood is obviously for mothers, the Vital Spark is not for mothers per se. So it's more just for women. And it really explores these qualities that were, someone put it in one of the reviews on Amazon. I really like the way this woman said this. She's like, the book explores the qualities that make you a difficult woman and how they're really important.
I love that because as I was listening to your latest Instagram reel, for those that follow on social, you can go follow Lisa. And you had talked about, I wrote it down because I was like, this is themes I see with women in our own lives. I love themes and patterns because those are deep, deep dives and invitations. One was victimhood.
Yep.
And I thought, ooh, that's a subject we don't really want to, it's a touchy subject because you don't want to be called a victim because that feels, or you're living in victimhood, that feels very judgmental in a way.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And passive aggressive and female rage. So it was kind of like these themes that you brought up. And I thought, these are deep themes. What came up when I said victimhood? Because that was one that stood out to me in particular.
Yeah. I mean, I think the book, it's not a political book at all. I really wanted to make it like a deep book, but also a fun book to read. And so I did that by just including a lot of stories. There are a lot of my personal stories in there, a lot of client stories, the fairy tales. So it's warm, it's human, and it's not polemical. But the book is actually very, very personal. It really is about, I would say, my own experience in coming to claim my authority more. But as you were talking about patterns, I mean, I found that a lot of the women I work with have very similar challenges. So that's really what's in the book is these patterns that I see. I find these 8 qualities, no particular authority to that list. Someone else might have come up with a different list, but these 8 qualities that I think women have a hard time kind of developing in themselves. And so this idea that I put forward in the beginning of the book, not my idea, but I loved this idea, that what we need to do is learn to become a worthy opponent. And that this is sort of, in a way, the other side of the coin to being a victim. Now, obviously, women do get victimized a lot. I mean that in the most kind of literal criminal justice sense, that women are, let's say that men commit a lot of violent crime against women. This is an archetypal universal. This has always been true. And in fact, some of the fairy tales really show that. All of these fairy tales showing women in grave peril who have to somehow use their wits to escape real physical danger. So this is just a fact. But there are ways that we can orient to that experience that are more or less empowering. And if we simply say, this is patriarchy, and we're going to kind of wait until patriarchy is vanquished before we can kind of claim our authority and go out in the world, we're going to be waiting a long time. So I'm very interested in what attitude can we cultivate that takes into account the reality of the way the world is, but allows us to go out and meet it in the most agentic way possible. And there's this idea of the worthy opponent. So I talk about it with fairy tales. I talk about it with some clinical stories. One of the stories that I tell in the book, which is still just an incredible story for me, is early in my career, I worked with victims of domestic violence. And as part of my training, I was taught once a man uses violence, it will happen again and it will escalate. So that was something that I would share with women who came to me who were in this really horrible situation. And it's what I knew to be true. And I think there is a lot of evidence for that. But then I worked in an inpatient drug rehab center in West Philadelphia. And my patients, crack cocaine and heroin users, this was in the early 2000s. So this was kind of before meth, for example, or other drugs that are out there now, but it was mostly crack cocaine and heroin. These women had really tough lives, very traumatogenic. Almost all of them had been involved in prostitution at one time or another. Most of them had been born in terrible poverty. I mean, this was a rough life these women had lived. And one of these women was talking about her husband used to beat her but he didn't anymore. And I was like, what? She told it was in a group therapy session. She told us a little more about it. She said, yeah, I got sick of it. And one day he went to hit me and I pulled a loaded gun on him and said, if you ever hit me again, I will kill you. And it stopped. And I was like, whoa. I'd never heard that story before, but I've heard versions of it since, similar kinds of stories. And obviously, I'm not suggesting that domestic violence victims should get firearms and try to settle this that way. That's not what I took from the story. And that's not the reason I included it in the book. I think the impression it made on me is like, wow, if you really stand up forcibly to a bully, they stop. So when I have women come in who are feeling somewhat bullied in their marriage, I'm not talking about violence. I'm not talking about a husband who's a really bad guy, but maybe just that guy who's kind of used to getting his own way and kind of harangues the woman or is just insensitive or doesn't pay attention to what she needs. I mean, that's terrible, but her impulse might be, well, maybe I need to leave. And what I'm thinking is, have you really, really demanded what you want? Because I'm always interested in what happens when a woman does that in that situation. Because sometimes the metaphorical gun, which is more something like, look, there's no discussion here. I need, I don't know, let's say more childcare. I can't do this anymore. There is no discussion. We're going to have more childcare. And then what does the guy do? Is he a jerk? Or does he say, oh, I didn't know you felt that strongly about it? So I think as women, we're not so used to doing that. And a lot of things can change when we get that kind of authority in our hands.
So I'm thinking of so many people right now. I can think right now of a client that in particular, if the husband just kind of wants to keep poking and poking, like talk about politics, they have different political views and just kind of keep on. And she's like, I tried to tell him to stop, but he just keeps going. How would you recommend someone really empower themselves?
Yeah.
Advocate for themselves in a helpful way for themselves. What would you say to, that's just an example.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good example because and I can relate to this myself. There are times when we think we've asked for what we want or we've told someone to stop, but we haven't done it with like a whole body sense of authority. And so there's always a little bit of a question in it. Like if you say like, oh, please stop or something like that. I was just thinking of a kind of a personal story, but I don't think it's super effective. So I'll not share it. But I'm thinking this woman, if she kind of meets him, first of all, maybe not when it's happening. Maybe they've had dinner. There's been no argument. She says, there's something I need to tell you. Look him right in the eye and say, this has been a pattern where you constantly needle me about politics. I don't like it. I don't want it to happen ever again. Something like that.
Very assertive, clear, and direct. And no passive aggressive.
No.
This is the other thing. I'm like, no. We're getting passive aggressive. And what does that mean? You're doing the same thing back. Only what you just said was very clear and direct. And clear and direct is kind. This is the thing people don't think. I'm like, this is actually staying in your lane. You're not being a theme and pattern of passive aggression.
Right.
You're assertive and clear.
Right. Even maybe with a statement about how it affects you. I find it nothing but upsetting. It isn't funny. It isn't entertaining. I find it demeaning. I need it to stop. Something like that. And then I'm really curious about what happens. Because if I'm working with someone like this and they do this and they come back and the guy still doesn't get it like again and again and again, it's like, well, obviously, I've also probably suggested that you go to my colleague who's a really excellent couples therapist too. Great couples therapy is hard to find, but so valuable. So I absolutely recommend that. But I'm really interested if the woman comes back and says he's not interested in couples therapy or he didn't listen or he got angry, on and on and on. Most guys, unless they're really a jerk, and there are jerks out there for sure, well, when they really get that you're serious, they'll change direction a little bit. Is this something about us taking responsibility for ourselves, right? Instead of, what a lot of us do, and I've been guilty of this and we all do it, is kind of wanting the other person to read your mind.
This drives me crazy with couples. I'm like, we have to communicate. Right. But we're like, I've told them 100 times. They should know by now. That's the catch 22 we get into.
I mean, and sometimes it's true. Are you saying it in such a way that the other person's, and by the way, this can obviously apply to same sex couples, it can apply to friendships, work situations. It's not just being married to a man, but it's like, have you said it in a sort of like you're saying a passive aggressive way where you're both kind of doing a dance together? Or have you said like, look, I'm not doing the dance anymore. This is changing, period. And I think that is this moment of, and there's different ways to do that. It really is this moment of kind of taking responsibility and finding your authority and putting your foot down.
And I think that's the theme that you're saying in the Vital Spark. How do we gain access to our vital authority, like within us, where we can be loving and we can be clear and direct and assertive. We can be compassionate and we can be, it's like the and both, and being able to find and access that because we're so conditioned out of it. We be a people pleaser, like accommodate everybody, caretake people. So that's the theme that we battle, I think, as women. Not all of us, but I think it is a theme.
Exactly. I want to just read, I always laugh at myself because you know how you learned in like 8th grade composition that you need to have a thesis statement? My book has a thesis statement.
Oh, good.
And I was so happy when I figured out. It was only right before I turned it into the publisher. And I was like, oh, I think that's what it's about. So I'm going to read you the thesis statement. There are qualities such as kindness, empathy, and agreeableness that can help us get and stay connected to each other. And there are fiery qualities such as anger, shrewdness, and forcefulness that can help us get and stay connected to ourselves. Roughly speaking, the first set of attributes fosters relationship, while the second set enables personal empowerment and assertiveness. Both ways of being in the world are important for psychological health and growth. Generally, women in our culture are permitted to access and develop the former qualities while we are discouraged from expressing or investing in the latter. So this book is about the latter qualities, not saying that the first set of qualities, the nurturing, kindness, warmth, acceptance, those are great. But we also have to have the capacity to access qualities like disagreeableness, shrewdness, trickster energy, desire, sexuality, anger, authority, and ruthlessness.
Are those the 8 qualities that you were talking about?
Those are the 8 qualities.
I was like, bada bing. So I was going to ask you about that. So, okay, can you name those one more time, just so we're clear on the 8 qualities?
And again, this was my list. Someone else might come up with something else, but disagreeableness. As women, I think we are probably both by nature and nurture used to being agreeable. So what is it to be disagreeable? Shrewdness, being kind of stuck in innocence, but being able to really see what's going on and like admit it to ourselves. And I can share little stories about any of these too. Trickster energy, being able to occasionally be tricky. The situation calls for it.
And we see people can have negative feelings about like, oh, I don't want to be manipulative. I don't
Totally. Sometimes when I present on the book, I've had reactions like that. Like, well, I agree with everything you're saying. Being tricky is being manipulative. I would never want my daughter to learn that. And I said, really? Because being tricky has saved my life. I hope to heck my daughter has learned to be tricky. Right? It's not for any of these qualities. It's not that I'm saying like, oh, you should become a trickster and go through the world like that. It is a capacity that you want to be able to put your hands on when it's required.
That is an important distinction. And I know we're going to go into number 4, but the capacity for these. And this is when we've had a lot of trauma or we've had a lot of layers. This has been conditioned out of us. We felt rejected or abandoned, maybe, and we connect that we don't have the capacity for someone to be upset with us or mad at us or disappointed or hurt. We like don't want any of that. So we're going to just do the people pleasing and the accommodating and the caretaking.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. So let's do number 4. We had trickster was the third.
Right. And then there's desire. What I mean by that is, what's your heart's desire? What's the thing you really want? A lot of times we don't even let ourselves know what we really want. And it can be so important to know what you want and let yourself know that you know what you want. And then there's sexuality, being in touch with what you enjoy and where you find pleasure. Because I think a lot of times it's so easy for women to kind of focus on the man's pleasure. And it's hard to kind of stand up for your own and say, oh, no, this is what I want. Rage, which I also spoke about in the motherhood book too. So that's another one that comes back.
Because people are really afraid of their rage. It brings up
Mm-hmm.
shame and guilt. So I want to talk about that one for sure.
Well, and especially for women, right? I think women's anger. I mean, I have a male colleague who's like, oh, I don't know, he's men in anger. That's a thing too. And I mean, I can get that, but I certainly know the female anger stuff. Authority. So being able to claim authority and ruthlessness. When I think of ruthlessness, I think of the ability to do the ability to do the thing that's going to make another person uncomfortable, but it's in service to growth or healing. So it's not making someone uncomfortable for the purpose of making them uncomfortable. And the little example that I give in the book is that at one point I was in therapy with someone and it just was not a good fit. It wasn't working, but I was young and I was like, oh, I don't want to fire my therapist because it's going to like hurt her feelings or she's going to feel judged or, and which is ridiculous now, right? When people are slow to fire me, I'm like, come on, this is yours. Just you do what you need to do. This is not about my needs. But at the time I was like, oh, and during that time, I had a dream that I was driving the car with Tony Soprano. And when I woke up and was thinking about the dream, I was like, oh, Tony Soprano would do what had to be done. He would do what had to be done, even if it meant potentially killing someone he really cared about, as happens in whatever that is, season 3 or something. It's like you do what you got to do. And so I had to kind of find my inner Tony Soprano to fire this therapist that just wasn't working out for me. So that's what I mean by ruthless. It's not that I'm going to become a hardened criminal. It's that I can find the aggression. I can find the aggression needed to prioritize my needs.
That was beautifully said. It's so funny. We're having a parallel because I was younger. I had a therapist that was doing a crossword puzzle in our sessions.
What?
And I'm not even making this up. It was my work. I'm so grateful because my work was to advocate for myself. So I was like, okay, I get it. So I got the courage up to say, are you doing crossword puzzles? And she's like, well, yes, me and the other therapists in the office have a contest to see who could do the most crossword puzzles. Because my whole shame story was I'm boring. I don't.
Oh my God.
So like,
oh my God.
How classic is this? Like you can't script this any other way. I was like, my whole shame story of I'm boring came to like, boom, there it was, all in its glory for me to work through.
Wow.
Yes. So I got the courage up because I talked to my friend because she was going to her and I go, is she doing crossword puzzles? She's like, I think she is. I go, I'm going to do this. So I'm like sweating bullets in the waiting room. It was the greatest lesson for me.
Yep.
It was the greatest lesson for me to access and advocate for myself.
Yeah.
And I was like, no, I don't deserve that. Like, this isn't okay. And I was able to confront her and say, I don't want to work with you anymore. So this is what you're talking about. These examples are what you're talking about. And let me ask you a question on these 8, because I love these. And these are not being talked about, by the way. I don't hear these being talked about. What would you say if someone says, well, these could be someone's defense mechanisms? Like someone has defenses, right? To protect them against shame and feeling not good enough. And so they have used some of these as defenses. How do you distinguish between using them not as defense mechanisms, but really as healthy towards becoming more whole?
Yeah, it's a great question. I love that question. No one's ever asked me that. I haven't thought about it. That's great. And I think defenses are so important. So I try to think about defenses a lot and read about them. So I enjoy this question. And certainly any of these things could be used defensively. Absolutely. But what I want to say is that for myself, and I think for a lot of women that I've worked with, I'm more likely to use the other characteristics, like, for example, fawning as a defense. Or, for example, I don't like conflict. I mean, and a lot of therapists don't, right? I like harmony. So I'm much more likely to kind of use avoidance of conflict as a defense. So one of the things about defenses is we obviously need them, but they're really a problem when they kind of become part of the character structure and they become really rigid. So I think it's always a good idea to say, like, what are my typical defenses? And my typical defense is, like, for example, being very, very agreeable, like in the face of conflict, just being like, oh, no, everything's fine. And that gets me penned into a space in relationships that isn't good. Trying to do my work around that, and hence the book. But sure, any of these could be defenses. Like you could use anger as a defense. I know women who are just sort of angry all the time. And it's really a defense against, let's say, vulnerability. Certainly, any of these could be misused. But I think for many women, the danger is that they're not used, is that we don't even have them in our arsenal. We don't
No,
have
these are
conscious access
scary
to
to
them.
a
Yeah.
lot of women.
Yeah,
You could
they
swing
are.
where some people are kind of stuck in some of these patterns as defense, and that's different. What you're talking about is those folks that they're uncomfortable with even or scared
Right.
even of these 8 characteristics, or maybe a few of them. Maybe they're fine with a
Right.
few, but when you
Yes.
bring up trickster, when you bring up there's so many in here that rage, like, ooh, like I don't have the capacity to really. There's a fear, there's a younger part. I don't know. I can't. How do people access these? How do we start to, and it's a
Yeah.
good question.
First of all, it's interesting because most people have really enjoyed the book, but there's like at least one review on Amazon that's like, I thought this book was going to help me like be more feminine, but she's really just advocating that we all just go out and be a horrible bitch. And I was like, well, no, that's actually not what I'm saying. Like you're saying, it makes people uncomfortable, which I can appreciate. And I know at least one person was like, oh, I loved it. And I suggested it to my book club and they were like, oh, no, I don't want to read that. So it is difficult. So first of all, you have to be honest with yourself. Are you suffering because you don't have access to some of these qualities? Is it affecting your relationship? I know for lots of women it does. And going back to the worthy opponent thing, I mean, I've seen it happen many, many times where a woman has been sitting with a lot of resentment, maybe so much so that she's always kind of flinging poison darts, but she's never just sat the guy down and said, look, this is bullshit. I don't want to do this anymore, whatever the it is. And I think like when you really do that in a way, then you're really claiming the marriage. Like this marriage matters. Let's not fool around. This is untenable to me that you're always, let's say, subtly putting me down or needling me about politics. I cannot live like this. This has got to stop. You're not a terrible guy. Let's make this work. When you really make that demand, I've seen marriages shift dramatically just because a new attitude, right? It's not like she does it once and that's it, but it's a new attitude. It is like, again, that metaphorical gun of like, I am putting my foot down. I need you to treat me with kindness, period. Whatever it is, that's an example. And guys, like the rest of us, can be a little thick sometimes. And sometimes it takes a bit to cotton on and it takes time to change habits. But with enough directness and forcefulness, things can really, really shift. So I got a little off track there, but you were asking, so how can you relate to these qualities? Well, I think if you begin to notice that you're suffering because you don't have them, either in your relationship or maybe there's something you really, 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 really want, but you haven't let yourself claim it. And the desire chapter sort of addresses that. I mean, I think I really, really, really wanted to write a book. And I sort of felt like, oh, I'm like one of those people who I knew when I was like 4 that I wanted to be a writer. Maybe I was 5, but I was really young. And I kind of never really took it seriously because I was like, oh, only really smart people write books. I'm not that talented. It took me a long time to be like, no, I'm going to do this. I don't care that it feels like it's out of my reach. I just have to really do it. And the years before, I think I was suffering in a way because I think there was something I really wanted to do that I wasn't making the space for it. So I think when you're suffering in some way, and there's plenty of ways that you can suffer, either interpersonally or in terms of these other issues, it's like, well, okay, I guess I'd better do something. I guess I'd better change something. And this kind of goes back to where we started with the victim, because I could blame everyone else. But what am I doing or not doing? How can I really take responsibility for whatever this is? And then I think it drives you to kind of feel your way into some of this. And what I hope I've done is, again, made it pretty easy to approach these qualities. Even though it's a serious topic, there's hopefully some funny stories in there too. And I hope I've made it kind of less scary and more approachable. But I think it does ultimately have to do with this very big job of reclaiming what Jung called the shadow. Those parts of ourselves we're not supposed to, there's things that we're not supposed to be. We're not supposed to be disagreeable. But when we can find those things that we have shoved aside because they've been disallowed, they can often be filled with a great deal of energy and they can be renewing when we get back in touch with them.
Yes, I want to address this big piece because I think when people say, I want this, the secondary gain, meaning I don't want to give that up because then I might lose my relationship. I might lose my
Right.
marriage. I might lose my friendship. I might lose my job if I
Hmm.
speak. Like they are so afraid. So they're like, I'm going to just do the same thing because I know what I'm going to get.
Right.
Even though I'm suffering, I'm more afraid to do something different than I am
Yeah.
just to continue just to keep, because I know what I predict that. What do you
Hmm.
say to those folks that just say, I am just scared to give up, like stop people pleasing, or
Hmm.
it's not all
Well,
or nothing, but like giving,
I'm
changing, accessing these 8 qualities more?
to just kind of stay with that example. I mean, I think one of the things about that, right, is that it's usually an unconscious trade-off. So, for example, I'm going to use a kind of extreme example just because it makes it easier to talk about it. But I know, let's say, again, little simplified, but I mean, but this happens too. Let's say a woman who has some ambitions, but then and especially I think this happened like generations back in my mother's generation, had some ambitions, but it was very scary to think about maybe going out into the world and getting that advanced degree or pursuing this or that career. And so instead, it's like, well, I was going to go get a graduate degree, but then I had kids. Your life presents you with an excuse and you take it. And certainly, of course, there are situations where that's real, but let's just assume that it's like, well, okay, but you might have been able to figure that out somehow. You had an excuse to back away from your dream and you took it. Usually, when we do that, it's an unconscious process. So, what happens in that case to this hypothetical woman is she finds that she's then resentful. She's resentful of her husband because somehow it's like, well, you get to work and I don't. She may resent her kids a little bit. She's unhappy and she doesn't see that she's to blame. And it's not about, oh, I'm going to blame myself. It's about responsibility. She doesn't see that she has the responsibility to change that. She's very unhappy and resentful. And then the other side of that is if we say, okay, look, here's what is, here's what I know. These are the facts. There's things I can't change, let's say. Like maybe in this hypothetical situation, there isn't money for childcare. And so the woman does really have to stay home. It's like, well, that's just so. But then there's like, there might be some things I could have control over. Maybe I could take a single class at a time and my husband look after the kids when he gets home from work. What can I control in this situation? What can I ask for? And so when you really shift into that perspective, then you're empowered. And yeah, it is scary to take responsibility for yourself because what if it doesn't work out? See, the thing is, if you never try, you never have to worry about failing. And you can always have that like slightly satisfying thing where you can blame someone else and then kind of feel sorry for yourself, which feels good, but forget what you want. You never get that satisfying relationship where there's real intimacy and mutuality. You get to always kind of sit back a little bit on the shelf and feel resentful and blaming.
And you're kind of stuck in freeze in a way, like your body's
Mhm.
immobilized. Like you're kind of just like, I am just frozen and there's nothing I can do about it. But really, you can. And that's really what we're kind of, this also is coming out of like these 8 qualities are kind of coming out of some of the defenses, some of the freeze response. Maybe
Mhm.
you've been trapped in for so long. It's there. You just haven't been able to access it because it wasn't tolerable for
Right.
one, for you, or for other people. And now, as you kind of reconnect to self and you realize, I have totally disconnected from my desires because a
Mhm.
desire was one on your list. I don't even
Mhm.
know what I want because I'm so disconnected. One of the things you're helping people do is reconnect
Yeah.
to
I think
explore that.
a lot of times we don't know what we want because it's too scary. It's too scary to really let ourselves know that.
The fear can be really big. What would you
Mhm.
say, or anything we didn't talk about today before we close our time together that you think was important to cover?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I want to just talk just a little bit about the shrewdness chapter because that one sort of surprised me. But what I'm really talking about is the way that we can tend to see the world the way we think it should be or the way we want to see it instead of just being like, nope, this is what it is. Rose colored glasses off. This is what I know. And then when we can really look at it like that, we're much more effective. We can protect ourselves better, but we can also get what we want more. It makes us more effective in the world.
This is a huge thing for clients because they're like in
Mm-hmm.
a fantasy or a hope of it, things being different. But I'm like, well, let's kind of take a deep breath. Let's look at today and the
Yeah,
reality as it is now. That's your whole fairy tale thing. I love that you're integrating fairy tales because I'm like, in our minds, sometimes we live in a story or a fairy
right.
tale or a
Well,
movie.
Well, and the fairy tale that I used in that chapter is the fairy tale of Snow White, because one of the things that's really so remarkable about that tale is, we all know the story, right? Her mother's going to kill her. She runs away to this cottage in the woods and she lives with the seven dwarfs, and the seven dwarfs go off and they say, Snow White, don't let anyone in. Your mother's out there somewhere. So there's a knock at the door the next day and Snow White opens the window and the woman's like, pretty wares to sell. And Snow White's like, oh, yeah. And she buys the laces and her mother laces her up too tight and she falls down as if dead. Well, the dwarfs come home and they rescue her and they say, don't open the door again. So the next day, what happens? The woman comes back, the peddler woman, she's got a new disguise on. She's selling the comb. And Snow White can't resist. She opens the door, she lets her in, she buys the comb. She falls down as if dead. The dwarves come home and they're like, Snow White, do not open the door. And of course she does. And that's when she eats the apple. But we know this, right? In our own lives and in our clients' lives. It's like metaphorically, don't open the door. Like, that this person, for example, let's say, is likely to not have your best interest in heart. Let's say there's someone in your life who always just takes the opportunity to make a jab at you. Don't open the door. Don't have that conversation or have it in a different way so that you can protect yourself or be ready with your armor or whatever it is. Don't keep opening the door. And I think there are many, many times that we do because we just don't let ourselves know what we know, which is like, oh yeah, she's going to come at me with an insult. You don't need to do that. You can protect yourself. You can let it in. That person or your boss or your mother-in-law or whomever is probably going to come after you with an insult, and you cannot set it up. Don't slip on that same banana peel. You can do something different.
This is so empowering. It gives people choice. Like you do have choice.
Yes.
And I think when you think you're stuck, you don't see that you have a choice. And I love how you're integrating the fairy tales into illustrations of what lessons have we learned? What is the deeper meaning and metaphor underneath this? Did those come to you pretty quickly? Like, did those metaphors just kind of in this fairy tales quickly integrate into the book?
Well, Jungian analysts, we love our archetypal material. We love our myths and fairy tales. So yeah, I read a lot of fairy tales. I love fairy tales. They are a storehouse of universal psychic patterns. They're ancient. They're beautiful. They're fun. And so I've sort of been sitting and living with a lot of these tales, and there's just a lot of wisdom in them.
So I invite everybody, if you just haven't thought that deeply about a fairy tale, see if one might be speaking to you in this conversation. You never know. The Snow White one might be like, oh my gosh, that is so me. Someone might be saying that. They keep doing the same pattern and you're getting entranced and it looks like it's in a different package. That's what people do in relationships. I'm like, it's the same pattern, just in a different package. That looks different, but it's the same pattern. And how do you start recognizing, like, what is it in you? Like Snow White, what is it in you that you were pulled towards in looking to fill? Like, oh, I'll get the comb, I'll get this, I'll get that. And that'll make me feel it's enticing. Well, this has been such a wonderful, deep, rich conversation. I'm so grateful for our time together. If someone's like, I love Lisa, I need more Lisa in my life, where can they find you?
Well, you can definitely follow me on social media, particularly Instagram. But probably the best thing to do is to go to my website, lisamarchiano.com. I have a mailing list there. It's not a very high volume mailing list, but I do run women's retreats and that kind of thing. And there's always information that goes out on that. And I have a women's fairy tale group online called Spinning Straw. You can either go to spinningstraw.com or it's also linked from my website, lisamarchiano.com. It's a really lovely, lovely group. And we do work with fairy tales in this way. And you can find information about my books there. And you can also check out my podcast, This Jungian Life, thisjungianlife.com.
So much wealth and depth. And if you're a mom, you're a new mom, or you've been in motherhood, please get the book Motherhood. It is so good. And I think it's going to speak to different parts than other books on being a mom. I really do. Yeah. And then the Vital Spark sounds like it's, like you said, we're really going into the next level of accessing these 8 qualities. So if you're like, I don't know if I could, you can. And that's the book for you. So you can learn how to access these and embrace them and welcome them in, not only tolerate them and build your window of tolerance, but you're welcoming them in as kind of advocates for you, not defenses, but ways to become more whole.
Right. Yes.
So thank you, Lisa, for being on the Close the Chapter podcast. I'm so grateful for your work.
It was a really great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Close the Chapter podcast. My hope is that you took home some actionable steps along with motivation, inspiration, and hope for making sustainable change in your life. If you enjoyed this episode, click the subscribe button to be sure to get the updated episodes every week, and share with a friend or a family member. For more information about how to get connected, visit Kristen, Kristen, Boyce, Boice.com. Thanks and have a great day.